Scripture reading this morning comes from Luke chapter 24, and I'm sure it's a story most are familiar with. It's called the Road to Emmaus story, beginning with verse 13. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, and this is just shortly after Jesus had been crucified, dead, and resurrected. And these two travelers were heading from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. And one of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem and do not know these things that have happened in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of the women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village in which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going to continue his journey. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. God's word for God's people.
Thanks be to God.
Well, it's a story I know we're all familiar with, and sometimes, like a lot of things that we're familiar with, if we reread them a couple of times over the years, as we have matured spiritually, as we have read more scripture, sometimes we find different meanings or something that we may have missed. Now I know, as I said earlier, most of us are familiar with this Emmaus Road story in Luke. Two of Jesus' disciples walking along the road, talking about all the things that had happened over the last few days. Now that is something that we all do, isn't it? Just as human beings. It doesn't make any difference what culture. Stop and think what has happened this past week on the world scene. Stop and think what has happened domestically in terms of floods and tornadoes. As we meet each other in different situations, we talk about those things. Whether we're sitting at a table in a restaurant or whether we're visiting someone in their home or in the fellowship hall, we talk about things that have happened, especially the big, shocking, dramatic things. And there have been some very dramatic things that have taken place over the last week. So they were doing that. What they were doing is the same thing that we always do when all these developments take place. We try to process all the who, what, where, why, and how questions that arise in our minds. Now, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would be willing to bet that anyone in this room, in this sanctuary, that was at least 16 years old, at least 16, in November of 1963, November 22nd to be exact, you can tell me what you were doing and where you were that day. I was in high school, 11th grade, upstairs. Administration building was the lower level, and I was in upstairs English class. While we were up there, we heard a loud scream. I mean, a blood-curdling kind of scream. The kind that frightened many of us. Our heads turned to the door because we had the doors open. Our professor was so concerned that he sent a runner downstairs to find out what had taken place. And the runner came back up and told us what had happened that day. President Kennedy had been assassinated. So all of these kinds of who, what, where, why questions enter into us, and we try to resolve and process. Cleopas and another unnamed disciple were doing just that, talking about everything that had taken place, all the shocking things. And I can't help but believe it had been a heartbreaking experience for them. The master that they had revered, that they loved, that they had followed, had just suffered a cruel death by crucifixion. And with his death, at least that moment in time, in their minds, their hopes were dashed. The dream was over. Even the reports of Jesus' tomb being empty did not really satisfy them or make them feel better. All it did was add to the confusion. How could a tomb be empty when they know he was there? Their thoughts and feelings were perhaps summed up in verse 21, where they say, "But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." And by using the past tense, we had hoped, well, what they're saying essentially is, we don't expect it now, but once we did, he was going to redeem Israel. We had this thing called hope, but now it's gone. Search your own lives, your friends, relatives. There are times in our lives when our hopes seem to be dashed. Have you ever lost hope? You know, once hope is lost, it is very difficult to recover. In fact, some people don't even want to hope anymore for fear of being let down again. I think something like that happened to me early in my childhood. I think I had mentioned in the past, my dad left, was requested to leave when I was 2 years old. So I didn't really know him. But when I got to the third grade, it was third grade, we moved from where we were living actually into a neighborhood with a house. And Mom got a phone call. It was my dad. He wanted to talk to me. Well, I got on the phone with him. And as Mom later informed me, he was over the alcohol limit, let's put it that way. But he was asking me what I wanted for Christmas. I said, God, man, I want a bicycle. Never had my own bicycle. I wanted a bicycle. He said, okay, I'll send you one. Well, first time I had ever talked to my dad, I was getting a bicycle. So I was excited. I knew it was going to come by a truck of some sort. So as it approached Christmas, I waited out on the sidewalk in front of our house every afternoon, waiting for that truck to show up. Christmas came and went. I waited, well, maybe it's late. As time passed, I lost hope that that bicycle was coming. And I don't know. Maybe that's part of why I'm a little bit different today. I don't know. But I didn't recover the hope that it would ever be there. Losing hope is not a good thing. So as these guys were making their way along the road, a stranger began to walk beside them. Now we know, because we've read the story, that this is going to be the greatest walk of their life, because we know who the stranger is. But they were kept from recognizing him. And I've wondered, have you ever wondered what was Jesus' purpose in not letting them know who he was right then? Well, I thought about it, and perhaps it was so that they would be in the same position as we are in today, 2,000 years later. We're walking on our spiritual journey. We don't see Jesus next to us. I'll come to some more reasons. Visual appearances of Jesus ceased with his ascension. And like the two on the road to Emmaus, we have to make do with other people's testimony that Jesus indeed has risen from the grave. We have been making do with other people's testimony for 20 centuries. And future generations are going to make do with our testimony that Jesus has risen. Now, just like those disciples, we don't always know what to make of that. Did it really happen? How did it happen? Somewhere on our Emmaus journey, we have to make up our minds as to what we really believe. When Jesus asked them what they were discussing, they began to pour out their sad story to him. Jesus, being a loving and compassionate Lord, did not embarrass them by reminding them of what he had already told his disciples. Unless a seed dies, it abides alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Jesus knew the frailty of strained nerves and confused minds, and so he did not suddenly reveal himself. It may have overwhelmed them. He slowly and gently revealed himself through Scripture. And he continues to reveal himself through Scripture and through those around us. The way he dealt with the situation is a good lesson, I think, for all of us who are in a position to help people who have lost hope.